Okay, so I want to take you back chronologically a little bit.
Sure.
So after graduating from Wesleyan,
Yes.
what did you do?
My senior year in college, I was looking at the future. I went at Thanksgiving and had a great Thanksgiving. My grandmother lived in Far Rockaway, and we would go down and have Thanksgiving with my grandmother. Sometimes my sister would join me. She was not in school anymore, though, and she was at Columbia. But I went down there, saw my grandmother for Thanksgiving, and hung out with my friends in New York with my friend Jeremy, and we went to the movies for 3 days. And during that time, I saw Blue Velvet. I saw, what is the name of the movie? God. River's Edge. I saw Supergirl. I saw Down by Law. It wasn't Down by Law. It was the next one. It was it was Down by Law, actually. Is that the one with Roberto Benigni?
I think with the Jim Jarmusch?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just seeing Blue Velvet and then seeing River's Edge, which was done simultaneously, but the same vibe. Blue Velvet in particular, I was just like, wow, this is amazing. I would really like to do this. And then over Christmas vacation, I was helping my friend's aunt, as I did often to earn money. She was an interior decorator, and we would help with the installations. You just stay in the apartment while people brought stuff in the last day. And I just remember thinking, like, what the hell am I going to do next year? What am I going to do? There was a chance of going to New York and getting a job in publishing. And someone had a lead at Esquire. And that was $13,000 a year, which was never a lot of money. People lived in apartments with 5 or 6 people. Now it's very clear. All I can tell you is Slacker came out like a couple years after that. That was a generation that was just about to graduate from college. And I had this idea that I would apply to the film school at USC while I was sitting in there watching these guys deliver furniture, because I was like, what am I going to do? I called, got the application, found out I had to take the GRE in the next 2 weeks, went back and took the GRE with no class, barely made it through the GRE. My scores reflected the fact that I was actually stupider than when I went into college because they were so much lower than my SATs. Had a moment during the GRE where there was this beautiful girl taking the test at the same time. And we were in a room at Yale, which is right down the road from Wesleyan, in the middle of the winter, 6 people taking this thing, this emergency GRE session. They had one last one for the year. And I just remember talking to her during the break and saying, why don't we run away? That's who I was. I did not know what was going to happen. And then I told my parents that I was applying, obviously. My father's on the faculty at the medical school, and he was on a committee with the dean of the film school, Frank Danielle, at that same time. Told him about me, told him that I was a poet, told him that I had this education, told him all these things. And I'm fairly positive that is how I got into film school. And by the time I graduated, I knew I was going to film school. I wasn't going to start until the next January. They had 40 people in each of the graduate classes, and I was going to be in the next section. And I just went home at the end of college, worked that summer in an internship I gave a speech. I was the salutatorian of my high school class. I was elected by my class to give a speech at graduation. It's not second in the class at our school. It was a popular vote. And I gave a speech that was very, very funny, and or perceived that way, and very honest, and was a big moment for me in my life because it got me a lot of attention. It kind of undid all of the bad things that had happened to me in high school in terms of being unreliable and a crappy student, all these other things. And more importantly, a kid in my class, Eric Burns' father was Alan Burns, who created the Mary Tyler Moore Show and Lou Grant, which had just gone off the air at that point. And he said, if you're interested, he said, you can do this. You did every kind of joke. You did everything. If you want to do this, let me know. And while I was in college, he would send me, during the summer, I visited him a couple times. He gave me some scripts to read. I didn't know anything about how it worked. And I think on some level I thought I was above it because I was going to be a poet. But it was in the back of my mind. And the minute I applied to film school, the minute I graduated, I called him and said, I'm going to film school. And USC Film School at that point was kind of like getting into Harvard Medical School. It really was a big deal. to be going there, especially to know what you're doing out of college. It was the ultimate kind of grad school that you could do. And it caused a lot of hubbub at Wesleyan, too, because I wasn't in the film program. And all these kids were making films and were super filmy and, were schmoozing and out here doing internships and working for movie stars and all these other things. And here was this guy who was writing poetry and in the Great Books program. And I had written a poetry thesis. So I called Alan Burns and he got me this internship. And we have actually, a couple of years later, we actually worked together on staff together, which was interesting at The Naked Truth. He had a deal with Brillstein, and he came in, and I was a staff writer. That was pretty amazing.
What was the internship?
The internship, I worked for Bruce Gilbert, who had made all of Jane Fonda's movies, and he was out on his own. And so I worked for free at MGM-UA in that building, Xeroxing and writing coverage on scripts, writing incredibly picky, cruel coverage that I'm still being karmically paid back for. That's when I read the stuff on the internet, I'm like, that's more payment for the kind of shitty, mean things that you said about these professional writers' work. I was an expert. I just trashed everything. I just remember that.
Was there anything that you liked?
Yeah. I liked Joe versus the Volcano, John Patrick Shanley's script. I remember thinking that was really cool, the way he had written that. A lot of it was garbage, I got to tell you. A lot of stuff I saw that came through there, and a lot of it is garbage. But it's just what your taste is, and who asks a 22-year-old to be the gatekeeper on, a movie? And I don't think I killed anything, and at the same time, I was trying to write a script too. I was writing a treatment for a script. Right when I got out of college. I did that during the internship also. But Bruce was very nice to me, and they never went into. And there was a woman named Dev Moss who was my immediate boss, and they were very encouraging. And he read my treatment finally. But I got lunch, and I did all that stuff, and I got coffee and answered the phones and did a lot of stuff very badly. And then I went to film school. I started film school that January, and that was interesting.
Did you fit in?
Grad school, I was the youngest person in my class. No one was really going right out of college. I was surrounded by a lot of people who were doctors and lawyers or who had tried to get into film school for a long time. And Frank Danielle had a thing that he wanted more writers in there. So I was probably the only person there who was not either rich with life experience or had been making movies since I was 7 years old. So that was interesting. And the undergraduate and the graduate were mixed together. So I just remember, I'm writing about dating a girl, and people are writing about their divorce. You're just like, it teaches you have more than one idea. I didn't think I stood out in any particular way. I still had the same thing that I had in other academic experience, which was, there are people who are just great at going to school. And they would put up a sign-up list for something, some interesting event, And by the time I had heard about it, it'd be full. The signatures would be full. And in fact, there were people who were so ambitious at the film school that the document would go up and there would be signatures on it because they had seen it in the dean's office or something because they were so wired in. But I did fit in, and I was really good at editing. And didn't get a lot of writing done, didn't finish anything writing-wise, but edited a documentary and sort of started finding that I was good at that, which is a lot like writing, especially editing a documentary.
What was it on?
It was on cryonics, where they freeze people after they die, and these two undergraduates did it. I was the only adult on the staff. They were in their 20s. We were all in our 20s, but they were 3 or 4 years younger than me, and they were just so great. They were totally from this fuck you school of filmmaking, and Timothy Leary was the main character in it, and it was like very a muck bookstore, which you probably, if you've lived here in Los Angeles, it was very what could be best described as counterculture at that time. It was very much about, they were very much a part of like the tattooing and the body piercing and all of that sort of thing that it's so mainstream now, but at the time it was very shocking. And so to go out there and watch them freeze a dead body and take it seriously and meet these people who were doing this and see their quest for eternal life, and the subjects of the movie were mostly gay men who were Catholics, lapsed Catholics or rejected Catholics, and some of them even had been in the seminary. And so to hear them talk about replacing religion with science, and they were completely conscious of it. It was intellectually very thrilling, and the movie was really funny and very successful. And then I just stayed in there, and I eventually made my own movie there. But for the most part, the faculty, I learned a lot about editing. I don't think I was really recognized as a writer in any way. I became friends with someone who taught the experimental film class, which was a critical studies class. It was seeing like the history of experimental film, seeing movies like Wavelength and Stan Brakhage and all of that stuff, and Peter Kubelka and all these other things, and had a huge impact on me, really did, in terms of like the plasticity of the medium, in terms of at what point are you making fun of the audience, at what part of the audience, at what part are you talking about just the sensation of watching a movie, all these sort of intellectual ideas that are great to write about, but I actually was very interested in them just in terms of like film language and seeing them. Just seeing, a movie like Don't Look Now, the Nicholas Roeg movie, and seeing that sex scene, which has already happened in backwards time and things like that, and knowing that was influenced by someone saying, this is cinema, it's a plastic medium, it can push time around, it can be dreamlike, and not just worrying about like the history of film. And then took a class about Joseph von Sternberg and Preston Sturges in the same class, which was fantastic. Took a directing class, which I embarrassed myself in.
In what way?
In what way? You had to do different jobs, and I was on camera. And what they would do is someone would be the director each week, and they would prepare a scene, and they would cast it, and they would also have to cut it, and then the other 3 people in your group would be the crew. So I was the camera operator, the cinematographer for that particular thing. We're shooting on video, and there was a feed that went into the room where all the students sat, and they would watch while the director was out there on the floor doing it, and I did not understand anything about the camera or how it worked. My mother was there as an extra because she was helping out my friend in my group, and I just remember zooming in and out. The director said to me, just get coverage. Just, it's an 11-minute scene. It was from The Heartbreak Kid. It was a very funny scene, but 11 minutes long. Just go in and get different sizes. So I was just riding the Zoom. And finally, it turned out that there were peals of laughter in the room. Everyone was just completely laughing at how awful this was. And the teacher came out, put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, what the fuck are you doing? And I said, well, instead of being defensive right away, I said, I understand I'm doing something wrong. My mother is right over there. If you could just refrain from embarrassing me too thoroughly. And he looked at me and he said, okay, we're going to go again from the top. You put your hand near that Zoom, I'm going to break your fingers. And we did the take with his hand on my shoulder. And this was a guy, his name was John Howe. And he had directed, lots of people had him as a teacher. He was very macho. And he had directed a lot of Adam 12 or whatever he had done. But that was really embarrassing. And, I took a class with Ed Dmytryk, which was fascinating. Took a class with Abraham Polanski, which was fascinating.
Did you talk to him about The Blacklist? You said that had been interesting.
Of course. I mean, you always get a chance at the end of the Dmytryk class. He always wants to bring it up. Those 2 men couldn't be in the building at the same time. They were both in their 80s. So there was a lot of talk about The Blacklist. And The Blacklist was still on people's mind at the school, too. These people are gone, You really found yourself sympathetic to Dmytryk, believe it or not, because it became apparent he was from nowhere. He had started working, he was a 17-year-old genius, He had gone to Caltech from Saskatchewan. And while he was at Caltech, had started being a projectionist at Paramount, which was a very dangerous job on nitrate stock. And eventually was hired to edit Duck Soup because McCary didn't like the guy who was cutting it. And he was a cutter for years and years and years. And just hearing him talk about, first of all, just give the man his life. But hearing him talk about politics and his lack of sophistication and his lack of understanding of those things, his idealism, it was at 85 years old, it was like my kids. It was like about life isn't fair. And he was from a world where life really wasn't fair. And then he said the most revealing thing of all. He said, there I was in jail, and he had made this movie, Christ in Concrete, and it won the Venice Film Festival, and there I was in jail. And I thought, I can't. What's it going to matter in the end? I got to think about myself. And that was fairly revealing. I'm not saying that all I can say is no one should ever guess what they would do in that situation, because you don't know. Especially in show business, where you fight so hard to get where you are and then you have it taken away because you won't play ball. It was very interesting. I think the unfairness of the whole thing, I mean, The Front had come out when I was in high school, and it was very interesting. But anyway, what else can I tell you about film school?
What was your thesis on?
I made a documentary about the paparazzi, and I followed them around. I tried to get a narrative film. I wrote a script that made it to the finals that no one wanted to do. I couldn't get into it. Was like a studio. You really had to pitch to them, and you could make a thesis film if you raised money, but I wasn't really prepared to that, and I hadn't really finished anything. The script that I was in the contest was the first thing I'd ever written, and of course I finished it the last minute. It was a 20-minute script, which is a very hard movie to write, 20-minute movie, very hard. I'd look at it now, and it's terrifying. I think I've only seen like 2 good ones ever, and like one of them's by Truffaut. But I couldn't do that, so I went with the documentary thing, and we followed the paparazzi around, and it was very fun. It was a very funny movie, very ironic, funny movie about, you know, what fame is about, what is this currency about in our language, and it wasn't that intellectual, like I'm saying. All I remember is that the head of the program, who has since talked about how what a dazzling student I was, turned to me at the end of it and said, "It's not your best work." At the screening. That was very satisfying. I can, to be honest with you, not to sound like I'm at war with the world all the time, there were teachers in my life who made a huge difference to me. One of them was Frank Reeve, who was my poetry thesis advisor at Wesleyan. One of them was a woman named Hope Boyd in high school, who, when I was completely fucking up in high school, just told me that it was going to be okay. There were a couple of English teachers at Harvard School who I was kind of a rat, you know, hanging out in that department, who in the end encouraged me. Because at that time, too, I started writing comedy things, and I was acting a lot, and I would write little things in the literary magazine, and I would write a letter every year to get people to submit to the literary magazine that was very funny, and all of that stuff sort of made a big difference. And in college, then I did a lot of theater also, improv, stand-up comedy. So all of that was like, I was becoming a performer on some level also, even though I probably never really had the balls to be a performer.
So when you graduated from USC, what was your plan? How did you?
Well, you know, I made the film, and I got married right at that moment. I met my wife while I was cutting another film that I completely screwed up. Using a stand-up moviola. I was too disorganized to be an editor, and I didn't like the movie, and I didn't understand what it was about, and I just didn't know how to do it. Cutting on film was very hard, but even harder on a moviola, and even harder with an amateur director that doesn't understand coverage or anything like that. And I also had a different style. Even then, I really didn't like too much overlapping dialogue, which you see in the show. And they were like, "This thing is dying." And I'm like, "It's not dying. It's much more interesting to see this woman try and put this speech together. No, this is an action movie. Make it faster, make it funnier, whatever." But having the film, and then you have a screening. And I did probably what was, I know David Chase talked about this, about his first show business move. I did my first show business move with this film, which was, they had this festival at the end of the year where they would show the student films, and people from the industry would come, and you could get an agent or whatever, and you would be discovered. And what I did was, they would have a documentary night, they would have the whatever night, they would have the other night. And I realized that no one was ever going to go to the documentary night, and that no one went to it, no one took those seriously, and no one was interested in them. And for good reason a lot of times, but I still think a 20-minute documentary is easier to make good than a 20-minute narrative film. Easier to make entertaining, that's for sure. So I suggested that we make a film festival out of it. And I appealed to these 5 directors who had each made one of the school's premier narrative films. I said, "You guys just want to go against each other in one night, and one of you is going to succeed, and that's going to be the contest? Or would you like to have one of you on every other night, and you'll be part of a film festival, and everybody will have a shot?" and and you'll force people to come to more than one night of it. So let's do a thesis film, a narrative film, a documentary, an animation, and do it night by night by night. Realizing that it was the only way that anyone from show business would ever see my documentary. And of course, I was aware of this when I suggested it, and they went nuts. They were so excited about it. And in the end, from that particular film festival, my film was the only thing that really got any attention because it was very funny and had movie stars in it because it was about the paparazzi. And I had that experience when I got back from my honeymoon. We screened the film, and I got calls from every studio. Everybody wanted a copy of the movie. Everybody wanted to meet me. All the agents wanted to meet me. And I had just gotten married. I didn't have a job. My wife was supporting us. I was writing a script for some program at USC where you were writing, they had some contest that I could continue doing even though I wasn't enrolled at the school. I was going to write a feature during that time, and which I did do. And so that was my life plan. And all of that attention fizzled out within about 3 months. And I was down to zero. And I said to my wife that I wanted to continue staying home and writing because the people I know that had jobs were not finishing anything. And that I had a better chance of writing, and that give me a little bit of time. I never put a deadline on it. She's an architect. She did not make a great living, but we lived on nothing, and we had help from her mother. And that's what I did. And I got more and more depressed, and I got fatter and fatter. And I wrote a lot, actually. I wrote a couple of features, and then you can get sucked into this thing where you can spend all of your time trying to hustle and get meetings and pitch. Everybody wants to pitch and sell a pitch. Or you can produce a product. And it's way easier to do the hustle than it is to write, especially with no deadline or anything. But I joined a writer's group. Maria Jacques Matan, who's on the show, was in my writer's group. I've known her that long. And that gave me a deadline. And I started finishing some things. I finished a script. I think I was 30. 29 years old was the first time I finished a script.
Was this a feature?
A feature, yes.
Around this time,
it was about the paparazzi, actually, also.
Around this time, too, did you appear on Jeopardy?
Yes, during that time, I appeared on Jeopardy. That was the payoff of all those years of reading trivia books. And I went and did that, and it kind of actually ruined Jeopardy for me, which was sad because it was such an important part of my life. Because once I'd lost, I just couldn't watch it anymore. Not because I'd lost, but just because the experience was, I was very close. I won a couple of them, and I was very close to actually winning all of it. And the way it ended, if you win 5 days, I could have, lived on that money for a long time.
How did you do?
I did okay. I won. I think I ended up winning like $12,000, and the day that I lost by $1, and I took the. This is kind of a life pattern for me that somehow this became something negative, even though I've gone on Jeopardy and won. The second place prize was a trip to Boston, and my wife and I went on this trip, and she'd gone to Harvard. And so we visited Harvard, and we sort of hung out in Boston and stayed at this hotel. And I just remember it just being a real low point. Just a real low point. Like, is this ever going to happen for me? How do I make this happen? What do I do? And while we were there, they announced on TV that David Letterman had a replacement. And Conan was introduced. And my wife, throughout our relationship, had always said, "You are the funniest guy that I know. You're the funniest guy that I know." There was one guy that I dated who was as funny as you are. And she came in from a jog, and I'm watching this thing on TV. She'd gone running somewhere in Boston, came in, I'm watching this thing on TV, and I'm like, they replaced David Letterman. She goes, "Oh my God, that's the guy." And I've since met Conan and said to him many times, I was like, as horrible as your first season was on, it was all from negative energy coming out of me. I would watch the show religiously, and she would come in at night, and I would say, "That's the guy, huh? Boy, he really is funny. I could see that." Just like, so petty. But at that time, a couple of things happened during those years. One was Bill Clinton won the election, which was the first person that I'd ever voted for who had won an election. And it's hard to explain to people on this end of Bill Clinton how meaningful that was to just feel included in American culture. in some way to feel that I existed on that level. And 30-something was on the air, which we were not, but we identified with a great deal. And it was a very special show for me. It was something, being out of work at that time. And I watched the hearings. Oliver North, I was out of work for that, saw every second of that. That was a mind-blowing experience to watch that guy come on TV and think, who is this? This is like Colonel Flagg from MASH. Who is this guy? And then to come to a commercial break and have the press say, this guy is a media star. He's amazing. I was like, really? He's awful. And Anita Hill hearings I also watched. So by the way, my lack of television I made up for in college. And it never really became a problem with my education, maybe early on, but I had a television set from sophomore year. And I won't even tell the story of how I got it, but I had a television set and I watched a lot of TV. I caught up on everything I'd never seen. All MASH, Happy Days, anything that was on during the week when I was growing up, I watched on TV. Quincy, I've seen every episode of Quincy. Jeopardy, was on in the afternoon, and I watched a lot of TV. So then trying to have the discipline to stay home and write and getting 3 or 4 hours of work done a day, which is a lot for a writer. I convinced myself of that anyway. I was finishing scripts. In fact, the last thing I wrote before I got so frustrated that I made a film was The Horseshoe, which was the 88 pages, this big plan I had that ended up being basically Mad Men, which is kind of interesting. I researched it, and I was really into it, and I thought it was going to be an amazing movie. But the first script that I had written, I kept pushing around, and I eventually got it down to like a $100,000 budget. And people were making these movies. Clerks had just come out. And I quite honestly saw that movie, and I was like, I know I can make a better movie than that. And it was such a sensation. It was in all the theaters. The guy had a career. I was like, I'm pretty sure I can make a movie as good as that. But it's more complicated than just making the movie, obviously. There's a lot of show business involved in the independent film world also. A lot of show business, almost as much as there is in the studio world. Sundance is not really a contest, and I learned all of this stuff the hard way. But anyway, I had a guy who promised to make this movie. I spent 6 months in which I stopped writing. I just went full-time waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for this guy to call me. We were going to sign the papers on Monday for 6 months, and at the end of it, it became obvious it was not going to happen. And so in about a month, I wrote an independent feature that required a fair amount of improvisation with regular people. I wanted to do like a John Cassavetes version of a comedy. So people would be speaking their own dialogue, but people do this all the time now, but at the time it was kind of an interesting idea. And it was a lot like Curb, actually. A lot like Curb, the movie. I played this awful person who was awful to his family and sort of got punished for it. And I shot the movie. I was rejected by all the independent film people who were supposed to help me. I shot the movie for $12,000. Used my car, my wife, everything in my life, all of my friends, got called in, all used my student ID that was 4 years expired to buy film, and hustled and made this movie. And I said to my wife, as soon as I finish shooting the movie, I'm going to get a job. And she never put pressure on me for that. And it was very autobiographical too. It's called What Do You Do All Day? It's about somebody waiting for the phone to ring who was supposedly writing. And because I had stopped writing at that point, I was just getting fatter and angrier and more bitter. And I have to say that making the movie, and then I went and got a job at Biography with a friend of mine who I'd gotten a job for a few years before that, Liz Bronstein. She does Whale Wars now. It really, really changed who I was on a chemical level. I was in the movie, first of all. I got my performing out. But I also felt like I did it. I didn't have to prove anymore that I was gonna do it because I had done something. And the process of making it was so invigorating. I felt so alive and so creatively satisfied after having been rejected all that time, after having been never been paid to do it, and just having people, I can't even explain. When I was teaching at USC, I tried to go over this with the students who were about to graduate. I'm like, it's not just being sensitive, but not having an agent, not having a manager, all that stuff will happen, believe it or not, after you make success for yourself. They will come to you. Don't count on that. here's the part that's really astounding. Just living your life every day and going in a social situation, having people ask you what you do is just traumatic. Because it's a series of questions that does not have an answer that makes you look very good or feel very good. So making the film meant that I could go another 10 years because I made the movie, not because I had something to say, but because I felt differently. And coincidentally, right when I was about to screen the film, as I was typing up, I bought the creative directory, as I was typing up labels on my parents' computer, because I didn't have a computer that could print labels, literally typing every single person's name in there to make a sticker, to invite them to my screening of my finished movie, I got a call from my friend Daisy, who had made Party Girl, which was part of the inspiration, actually, that I thought I could do a film, because Daisy had done this movie. It was about a $300,000 movie, and she did an amazing job on it. It's a very funny movie, and it was very inspiring to me. And she encouraged me, and I was like, I'm going to make a movie. I'm going to do that. I can do my version of a Spike Lee movie. I'll just use all the money. And anybody could get $20,000. You could. That's all you needed to make the movie. And while I was working at Biography, I bought a hard drive. I put the entire movie on a hard drive. It cost $2,500. And I said to the people who own the editing bay, I had an editor, I'm like, call me whenever you have one that's open and let me use it for free. Anything that's down. And we would just unplug this thing and plug it into whatever room people weren't using. All simultaneously while I was working on Biography. And so anyways, the Biography thing was sort of ending. I was working somewhere else while I was finishing the film. I worked on this Nixon CD-ROM out in Orange County, which was a very, very unpleasant experience, actually. And Daisy got this pilot and invited me in to come and do Punch-Up. She called me on the phone. I'd given her a joke over the phone. She said, they threw everything out in the pilot except for your joke. I want you to come in and sit at the table and try and help make it funnier, and you can never tell anybody that was your joke. And so I went in, and I got to drive to the Warner Brothers lot and walk into this room with a bunch of professional comedy writers. I didn't even know there was such a job. I didn't even know people sat around a table and pitched jokes, and that you didn't have to be prepared, and that you could just try and be funny at the moment, and that I didn't know the etiquette either, by the way. I didn't know that you don't say to people, that's not funny, I've got something funny. You know, there are people who still hate me who were there that night, the first night I was in that room, because I behaved very badly. I didn't know that. I wasn't being arrogant. I was just trying to being like a normal person would be in the situation. There is an etiquette that keeps an environment where people feel free to fail, and I was violating it constantly. But Ephraim Seeger, who ran the show, at the end of the night said, can you come back tomorrow? And so I worked on this pilot. The show got picked up. I had no spec. He hired me as a staff writer. I went and screened my film at a couple of festivals while I was at that job, and I had my first job in TV. And I was, I have to say, I was really good at it right away. It was kind of astounding to me that I could do that right away. And it was a perfect environment for me. It was very competitive, and they were sending me out of the room to write scenes right away, and all the TV shows that I knew that I loved, like Green Acres and stuff that you couldn't do anywhere, I could do there. And the show was canceled by the Jewish holidays, and I was out of work. And my agent already wasn't calling me back, the first agent that I had. No one had done anything with my film. I signed with them because they were going to show my film everywhere, and they never did. And there were people who'd gotten features off of, this was a feature film that I made. There are people who'd gotten jobs, but once you get into TV, they just saw the money there, and they're like, this is what you're doing. Also, I don't know if they can get you a film. I don't know how it works. I think people do it on their own now that I'm more experienced in show business. I think no one's really ever been gotten anything. So I wrote a spec. I wrote a spec Frasier, and then I wrote a spec Larry Sanders. Over those 3 months, we had just had our first child. My wife was back at work, and I stayed home and I wrote. And I said, I'm going to get another job. I'm going to do this. I got paid a lot of money for those 3 months that I worked, even though it was the bottom of the food chain. And I enjoyed it, and I was really good at it. So, of course, unrelated to anything, there was a guy named Mike Saltzman who had been running Murphy Brown, and he had met me because he had heard from someone that this guy had gotten a job on a sitcom with no spec, that he was just a joke guy. And we had met him for dinner and befriended him and his wife. They were about to have a baby also. And he got a show, and he called me up and said, send me your spec, and I'm going to put you on The Naked Truth. That's my show. And I was like, it's about the paparazzi. It's great, whatever. And then I had a job. And also, I made myself available for pilots, so that people knew that I would come in and work for free on anybody's pilot. I worked on Ephraim's pilots, and I worked on another pilot too. I was like, get me in there. Let me spend a day with these people so they know that I'm funny and that they wouldn't hate being in a room with me for 24 hours, which is really a big part of that job. And so that's basically how I got like my second job, which is almost more important than the first job.
Now, did that film that you had done on paparazzi, did that play
No,
into
the
it at all?
documentary was about the paparazzi. Did it play into the TV show?
Into The Naked Truth, yeah.
Yeah. We showed it. I mean, everybody wanted to do something about the paparazzi thing, and everybody wants to make a movie about it, and everybody thinks it's funny, but A, La Dolce Vita is out there, the greatest movie ever, where the word was invented, and B, when people look at La Dolce Vita, they don't want to make that movie, because it is very unpleasant. It is not something that anyone wants to make a film about. The photographer cannot be the main character, let's put it that way. It's just something in our society that we will not admit that those people are there for us. We will not see that side of ourselves. And actually, on The Naked Truth, about 4 or 5 episodes into its run, Princess Diana was killed in that car accident, which was blamed on the paparazzi. And the show was really stuck in the toilet, and no one saw it, and we knew it was over. And that was a miserable year.
You really think it had that much impact?
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. They already didn't want us making fun of movie stars. Don Ohlmeyer, who was in charge of NBC, was like, we couldn't make a joke about O.J. Simpson. We couldn't make a joke about any movie stars at all. I mean, O.J. was someone who people were making fun of at that time. And they were very uncomfortable with slamming celebrities to begin with. And we really didn't slam celebrities. We just mentioned them. I have to get a picture of Sly Stallone and his dogs. And they're like, I'm a friend of Sly Stallone, and I don't want you mentioning his name on the show. So that was a problem. And then there was this feeling that the paparazzi had murdered a princess who was one of the most beloved people on the planet, it turns out. And it was I was watching the funeral in the middle of the night on TV, and my wife was like, we were like, it's over, the show's over. And there was something else that happened there too. I mean, it was a bad experience, that show. It was tough. The writers didn't get along. Now that I've been working for a while and I know about the 7 or 8 things that can be wrong on a sitcom, it had like 7 or 8 of them. So that was tough. But I met Tom Palmer, who was the co-EP on that show, and he said that if he got a show, which he did, that he would hire me. And so I went and worked on Tom Palmer's show. Got a couple of meetings in between, but never had anything to leverage any kind of, money or anything like that. And I worked with Diane English and him, and that was a great experience. That show was called Living in Captivity. And Diane was very good to me, and Tom was very good to me. They really let me sort of blossom. And I started learning more about story. And ironically, I found out David Chase was in the building writing The Sopranos while I was on that show. We were in the exact same building. It's only a 4-story building out there. And we used to see him all the time. And I don't remember, there was a joke about how miserable that guy was. But that was a guy from Northern Exposure, and how he was writing a pilot and how miserable he was. I didn't know one day he would be my boss. But the ironic thing is that went down, and I got this job on Becker, which was definitely an agent-did thing. They got me the meeting, and Diane recommended me, and I met Dave Hackle, and he said, I'm looking for someone who can write drafts, and I heard you can do that, and that was already stunning to me, that I had a reputation for that. Because it's very important to be funny. And being a joke guy, I mean, I worked with Bob Ellison. It was like, there's no shortage of value, and also glory, just personal glory of being in the room and having the big joke and seeing it, It's a great experience to be that way. But you start to see right away that to have your own show, or to have any kind of sort of lasting impact to have any control of your career even, you really have to start, to be a writer in television, you really have to learn the rest of this stuff. And I was pleased that at this point, 4 or 5 produced episodes into my career, that I was known for that, and not just being a joke guy, although maybe I wasn't as funny as the real joke guys. But, and then I went to work on Becker, and that was a tough experience. The Sopranos happened during that, and Lost, which I saw the pilot of and was kind of like blown away that they would spend that much money on something. I have very high standards, and I really was always fighting to do the best job that I could. And let me tell you something, the writing staff on that show was spectacular. There's a guy there named Mike Markowitz, who was one of the funniest people I will ever meet in my life, who I still wake up in the middle of the night and laugh at things that he said 10 years ago, 13 years, seriously. And Russ Woody was there, who was a television icon at that point. He had been working, he was a PA who had been discovered and understood story and was just an interesting person, very encouraging to me. There were 4 or 5 other people on there who I considered to be really, really good writers. And David Isaacs would come in 2 nights a week. Chuck Ramberg and Ann Flett Giordano from Frasier would come in a couple nights a week. Ken Levine was in there, of Isaacs and Levine, that's who they are. Bob Ellison was in there. And let me tell you something, those people think you're good. They say one compliment to you, you can live on that for a long time. And the other thing that should, I trash this experience frequently because it did, well, one, in the most dark sense, it drove me to write Mad Men because I was so miserable with the idea that this is what I was going to be doing for the rest of my life. I was in TV by accident and in sitcom by accident, and sitcom was in a very bad place, and I really hated it, and that was part of the reason I wrote Mad Men. But on the other side of it, Dave Hackle was great at running the company, and we really didn't have an awful life there. And in terms of the way it affected my writing, I felt that I was as funny and as good as I'd ever been. I learned a lesson that a lot of times, well, it takes just as much work to make something bad as it does to make something good. And there was a lesson in the fact that there was so much amazing, funny stuff that came out of that room that did not go in the show. That was painful, but also satisfying because you knew that there was amazing stuff. And also casting. I mean, Ted, that guy is like just a very special person with very special talents. And the garbage that we gave him half the time that he would make funny, and his precision and his attitude, his humility about his position, this was 2 series after Cheers. I mean, the guy is still an icon, but it was just astounding. And just seeing that he could play this awful, awful person, and because he was Ted Danson, it didn't bother you. That was a big lesson, and obviously a lesson that I learned again with Tony Soprano. So I wrote the pilot there. From when I got on to Becker, I was starting to do something else at night. I was researching this. This was my mistress. I had this idea. I don't know where it came from. I don't know how it developed about doing a thing set in the 60s or the 50s at that time. Actually, I picked 1960 by the end of the process. I paid someone to do research because the internet was not easy to navigate at that point, even with a Prodigy account. And the first piece of research I got in was all about the crisis in cigarette advertising in 1960. But what I really wanted to do was do a story about someone who was like me, who was 35 years old and who had everything and who was miserable. That was what I was interested in. And my agents didn't take it that seriously. I think I hounded them so much that they let me go out and pitch it a couple of places. And one of the places I pitched it, it was to a man and a woman. And when the man got up and left the room after the pitch, the woman turned to me and said, you just told the story of his life. And I was like, well, that's interesting. Because I told a story about a guy who lived in New York and hung out in the Village and was in advertising and was a frustrated artist and had sold out in some way, but still was trying to find out who he was. And it basically evolved in the pitch to, well, why don't I just make him married? Because this guy was married. And then it evolved to, why not hide that, make it happen in one day and not even tell people he's married till the end of it, let them fall in love with him. And so that's what it is. And I ended up writing the pilot after 2 years of research and writing a scene here and there and having dialogue come to me in my head. I ended up it was the first thing I ever did this way, dictating it, because I was working at night after hours, after a full day on a sitcom. And that became very important to my writing process, actually, which was that I would hire a writer's assistant, pay them like a trainer so that I had to work because they were sitting there. And then I would dictate, lay on the couch or walk around with a writing crop like Billy Wilder, and just like I wrote it in the Lasky building. I wrote it in a few offices, did the research, but I finally wrote the thing, and it came out all at once. It came out in like 10 days. I had an outline, but it was just a bunch of scenes.
How close would you say it was to the pilot that eventually?
Oh, it's exactly what was shot. I changed a couple things in editing, and I added a couple jokes.
What about the title?
And the title came out at that moment too, and I just assumed. I remember, it's one of the experiences I have when you win an award or something, or when you get nominated, or when people say something to you. I go flash back to that moment when I wrote it. When I wrote Mad Men it was in my notes. I always called it the age of advertising or advertising age or something like that. And then in one of the books that I read was this phrase, Mad Men. And then the idea, it was on the title page. It said Mad Men. And then the other page, the second page of the pilot, it says, it has the definition, a term coined, used to describe the advertising executives of Madison Avenue, period, then a space, they coined it. To me, it was right in the script, yes, in italics, and then the next page was the beginning of the script.
But was that because it started with that black title? That title.
I put it in the show. I didn't know I was going to shoot it, but everyone loved it so much. They're like, "You got to put that in the show," because it's explained everything. It's the posture of these people, and working in television all that time, it really fit. And by the way, I couldn't get my hands on a 1-hour script. I never read one even. I didn't know about act breaks. I knew about act breaks from half hour. I knew I didn't want to do them. I knew that they wasted a lot of the audience's time to recap to make a big false sense of jeopardy right before the commercial, so they'll come back after the commercial, and then to recap it after the commercial. That was literally like a minute of the show was going to be wasted on reminding people what was going on. I was like, you know what, tough shit. And while I was writing it, The Sopranos came on the air. And I watched the pilot. I was like, whatever. It's black humor. I got it. It's, my wife continued to watch it because she was blown away. And then episode 5, college, she said, you have to watch the show. Sit down and watch the show. And I watched the show, and I talked through it the entire time with her. When it got to the end and Tony killed the guy, the father, the main hero of the show, with his daughter on a college visit, who I recognized everything in this show. The strip malls, the colleges, the car, the conversation, the husband-wifeness of it, everything. I recognized it all. And I turned to her, I was like, do you understand what's going on here? They just broke every rule in TV. This show is the real thing. And I was writing my pilot, and I just said, if Tony Soprano can kill people, Don Draper can sell cigarettes. And I didn't know about the casting thing, but I thought, I'm modeling it on a lot of movies that I like from this period, and TV shows and genres, and on the writers that I admire, Patty Chayefsky, Rod Serling, Reginald Rose, the golden age of television. I wanted to write a Playhouse 90. And I thought, even if I never sell this thing and no one wants to make it, and HBO, I can't even get a meeting at HBO, which I couldn't for years, I have a sample that says I can write. I want to be a writer. Here's my dream show. And I always kept out hope in my heart that it would be a show.
Why do you think it was rejected so early on?
Well, you have people sitting in this chair talking about network TV all the time. Let's see. It's filled with smoking, which you're not even allowed to do on TV anymore. The main hero is a philanderer. It's period. And I'm nobody. That was what it was about. Over and over and over again. It's really great. What do you really want to do? This is the best pilot I've ever read. Now, what do you want to do? Have you ever seen TV? We can't do this. It's a period piece, which people hate. It's too abstract. These people are all awful. All that smoking. There's just nothing in it that interests us.
Did you ever think about producing it yourself?
Yeah, I thought about converting it into a movie. I had opportunities to do that, and I just thought, it's not a movie. It's a TV show. I don't want to see this wrapped up. The irony resonates much more if it's just a regular day in the life, and then these things sort of pop out at you. Financing something yourself, you know what I mean? I always wondered, I was surrounded by these zillionaire TV writers who were always trying to get into the feature business, and I'm like, why don't you just make your own movie? And then you kind of realize that they can't, or they don't want to, or whatever. I would, if I had enough money to do that at a certain point, I probably would take the chance and do that. But once you're outside of the system like that, if you're going full John Cassavetes, you better be committed to making more than one movie. You better just say, this is the way I'm going to be making movies. Because it's not like Hollywood's going to pick it up and embrace you for doing that. It's a very, I don't know, it's a very hard road to go. But I didn't have any access to it. All I can tell you is that I never gave up on this thing. And there was not one executive or one meeting that could possibly be had based on this script for movies, for TV, for anything, sitting on a plane next to somebody where I didn't bring this thing up and say, do you know any way I could do this? Or, doesn't that sound like a good idea? Or would you read it? Because I even when I was on Sopranos, you know, I remember coming home and looking at it. It was in the, you know, because I was working in New York, and I would fly home on the weekends or a couple weekends a month to see my family, and it was in the end table, and just taking out and looking at it and just saying, like, this is really good. Why can't I do this? I think people would love this, you know?
Well, let's talk about The Sopranos and
Sure.
how you got onto that show, especially coming from sitcoms.
Right. So what happened was, I finished the script. I was at Becker. I signed with a manager right after that, Keith Addis, who was going to help me with my film career. But I gave him the script. I'd literally finished it about 3 weeks beforehand. I don't know what he thought about it, except for talking about work ethic. Even on Becker, at this point, I was a supervising producer. I always wrote spec scripts, not just for myself, but like to get a new job. Like, I knew that no one was going to read my naked truth. So I had a Larry Sanders that had got me that job, but I still wrote A King of the Hill. And then I wrote a Malcolm in the Middle. And no matter how high up I was, I always had heard the story about, maybe it was Peter Casey and David Lee, that they were running the Jeffersons and they wanted to be on Cheers, so they wrote a spec Cheers. I heard that and I was like, and Tom Palmer had said to me, no matter what happens in your career, if you can write your way out of anything. And that was in the back of my mind always. And so anyway, so I gave the pilot to the agents. This has been documented, and I know it's probably they hate hearing the story over and over again, but they had no interest in it. They gave it to someone at HBO, supposedly, who, instead of getting me a meeting to go in and talk about it before I left the script, because I had a fairly dynamic pitch for it. It's easier to pitch something when it's already written, by the way. At least for some people. For me, it is. I said, well, you know, Alan Ball and David Chase are there. Can't you just give it to them? Maybe they can take it to HBO? That's all I wanted. They were both at UTA, which was my agency at the time. And they were like, Alan Ball only reads playwrights, and David Chase, we like to send our feature people and our Law and Order people and our 1 Hour people, so no. And at this point, sitcoms were starting to dry up. And the fact that I had a job and had a good reputation and was sought after to help with pilots and everything like that, I had a little bit of leverage. And my manager said to UTA, if you don't get this to David Chase's agent, who's in the building, Matt's leaving the agency. So Peter Benedek got it. He loved it. And I'm not saying that my agent at that time didn't have to lobby very, very hard to get him to read this. It's just who knows how that business works. But I had a hard time getting an agent at my agency to read the script. And she fought very hard to get her boss to read it. I was at this point had left Becker. And I left it. My contract expired, and I decided not to, even though they pursued me, not to continue there because I really didn't enjoy it. And I thought it was time to do something else, and I thought it would kill me to keep working there. And I actually took having no job over what turned out to be a lot of money to stay there. And my manager encouraged me to do this, and my wife supported me to do this. With the hope that I would work in a video store if worst came to worst, with the hope that I would land somewhere. And I landed on And Director Controls the Universe, mostly because the people at Paramount were so impressed that I left this job. It was the same company. And I enjoyed working there too for Victor, and it was a great room, and a lot more of the funny stuff that was pitched ended up on the show, and the show had its problems or whatever, it wasn't supported, or maybe who knows if it was good or not. I thought it was good. I thought it was very funny, and I had a great time there, and it was very respected, which Becker wasn't for whatever reason, and that was frustrating also. But anyway, David Chase read the script and called me. And I called him back to have a conversation with me during my lunch hour. And everybody left for lunch, and I just only the person who gave me the message, and I was like, oh my God. And I talked to him for an hour on the phone in the trailer at Paramount. That's where we did Andy Richter in a trailer. And he wanted to just talk about the pilot. And so then they said, and I wanted to talk to him about the show because honestly, during these dark moments when I was writing this thing, I kept reading interviews that he was 55 years old, and I was like, I just have to hang in there. I just have to hang in there. He was an inspiration to me, I can tell you that right now. And I told him that. I said, it's an inspiration to me that I didn't realize that he'd been working on these gigantic shows all the time. There was no IMDb for me to look. There was, but I didn't know what it was. He was a giant to me. And the show just reeked of integrity, and it was everything. It was the Yankees. I mean, my joke was when I got on The Sopranos, people asked me how different it was from my other job, and I said it's the exact same thing. I sit in a room with a bunch of writers all day talking about The Sopranos. We had the moratorium. You couldn't talk about it on Monday morning if people hadn't seen it. And so then they made the agents, I went to New York, and I had an interview with him, and I got the job, and I worked one more week on Andy Richter. We were done, and I went and moved to New York.
Were you expecting that? Because originally you had said that it was really to get it to him, to get it to HBO.
No, I wasn't expecting it at all. I didn't know why he would want me on the show. They're like, he hires people like that to write. Terry Winter, who, was the other writer who lasted to the end with me, and obviously a huge part of The Sopranos, had worked on Sister Sister and the PJs right before he was on there. And David is a comedy writer. David's very funny. And, having been in that world, but it had some prestige to it in the comedy world because it was like the joke was I was the Jackie Robinson of comedy because no one crosses into those things, but I had this pilot. And, that was it.
Let's stop to change the tape.
Sure.